Good morning. It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but you are going to be freer after this hour with Sharif El-Mekki and our guest this morning, who we will tell you right on the other side. Good morning, fam, good citizens. You are with us for another Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but you are going to be free soon, at least freer than you are now after this hour of Unpublic with Sharif El-Mekki and Citizen Stewart. Our guest today is Michael Cord, African attorney, radio and TV host, newspaper and magazine columnist, adjunct professor, and most importantly for our good health and the earth, a vegan. Welcome, brother.
Thank you for having me, and good morning.
We really appreciate you coming to the Plant-Based Podcast this morning.
I love it. I love it. Yes, yes.
The Afro Plant-Based Podcast. We appreciate it.
Yes.
Well, we are happy to have you here this morning. Sharif, good morning to you too, brother.
Absolutely. Good morning. Great to be here. Great to see Brother Cord on the show and returning. A lot of times programs say, "Oh, we're going to bring you back," and folks don't actually ever come back. So we are, I'm really glad that this is happening today.
Well, I appreciate both of you. Definitely appreciate, Sharif, that you have such rich and genuine relationships with such a cross section of just brilliant, crazy, capable people. Like it's almost like you have a family of Afro thinking people, which is amazing. I would like to say that I do too, but sometimes my portion of the family, we have that. We're that family that doesn't get to every party.
Yes.
Listen, it's such important, and I'm grateful. I used to say I'm like the most mentored person, that I know, but also early on learned like, you know what, do this work in community with others, find the folks who are fighting the fight on different angles, but there's a common thread of love for our community and quest for Black liberation that just binds us all. So, yeah.
I love it. And we have what we need in terms of educated thinking people. And when I say educated, I don't mean the Western definition of that. I mean the wise definition of that, but we don't always tap into our people at the right time. This is the right time. Brother Cord, this is the right time, because right now we have a national issue, I think, of great import that we might be sleeping on. We have nationally a Black thought system that is under indictment and trial by the news media, lawmakers, people with decision-making power, who have rebranded critical race theory as being an existential threat to white America and to America overall. And you are someone who has pointed out that before we even get to saying whether that's true or not, we have to just start with the fact that the critics are ignorant about what it actually is, and they don't even know what they're talking about. So can you tell us, start us out with what are they getting wrong about critical race theory and why it's important that they are getting it wrong?
Once again, thank you for having me, and thank you for starting out with a great question. You initially stated that many of the critics look at critical race theory as an existential threat to their existence. And if their existence is white supremacy, then I agree. Critical race theory is and should be an existential threat to white supremacy. And by the way, I use the phrase white supremacy, but I also add to that white savagery. And what I mean by that is this. When we say white supremacy, the implication is almost that white people have gotten to the top of every category on the planet because they were supreme. That's not true. They got to the top of every category because they were savage. They were doing things to people that no other people had heard of. So for me, I want to make clear that when I say white supremacy, I'm including in that white savagery. Now, having said that, let me go right to your question. The question is, what is critical race theory? Before I tell you what it is, let me break it down in its fundamental parts. When we say critical, what we're talking about is a careful evaluation. When you critique something, you engage in a careful and judicious evaluation. Okay, that sounds good. Race. Well, we all know that there's really no such thing as race. But when people talk about race, what they're talking about is how people look, basically, the complexion of their skin and the texture of their hair. So that's what we're talking about, separating people based on how they look. That's the race part. And theory, it's interesting because I defer to those who came up with this name. And I'm going to talk about the person who came up with the name critical race theory. But I don't really see it as a theory, because a theory is almost like a supposition, almost like conjecture. But I guess you can argue that a theory is also a plausible conclusion. But I go further than that. I say that it's not so much critical race theory, it's critical race fact or critical race science. And here's how it goes. First of all, you talked about, and I'm going to wrap up this introductory comment in 1 minute, because in 2 minutes, if I don't say that, we'll be going on for 2 hours. So let me just say this for 2 minutes, and then I'll listen to your comments or follow up. So now we know what critical race theory means as we break down each of the words. But once we put them together, what is it? Well, before I say what it is in these 2 minutes, let me say what it's not. It's not Black Lives Matter. It's not reparations. It's not an academic program for preschool students, for elementary school students, for middle school students, for high school students. It's not even really a college thing. It started out as a law school thing. And if we have time, I'll run through the list of the law school scholars and professors in terms of what they did. So it's a law school concept designed to look at race and racism in America from a legal lens, from a law-based lens, because the concept is this: hey, racism in America came from a policy of racism, but you got to put some muscle behind that policy. How do you put muscle behind that policy? You put muscle behind that policy by creating laws. So these laws are the bodyguard for the racist policies that is America. So we who advocate critical race theory, we look at it from a legal perspective, from a law school perspective, and look at the laws and explain how the laws promote and enforce racism.
You're on mute, Chris.
There's your master class, fam. Right there. There's your master class on You Have Just Been. Okay, well, this has been a good show. We appreciate y'all for joining us today. So it is a let's just pull out a couple of bullet points, fine points here. Mm-hmm. It is a higher ed thought system or legal theory with the basis in critical legal studies. It is not the popular movements that you see online. It is not a hashtag. It is not defund the police. It is not all the slogans that conservatives love to beat us over the head with, even though it's being used as a catch-all for those things. Right? It's not the training that your kid takes at a school, the diversity training, the courageous conversations, all that stuff. Right. And it's important for us to do what, though? Like, as we see the lie, what is becoming a version of the big lie in this thing, I don't see the handlebars. Where are the handlebars on how we respond to? Because it's easy, like when you have an American population that is well positioned to accept lies. It's hard to be the truth teller. Right. It's easier to be the devil than the savior in this case. So what do we do?
I always tell people it's much easier to be a demolition expert than it is to be a construction worker. Anybody can knock stuff down. The question is, who can build stuff up? So what do? We do two things. We engage in the fight. And in this fight, we throw a 1-2 punch. The 1-2 punch goes like this. The one punch is to explain what critical race theory is and how it applies to lawyers and law school students as a legal concept. That's the one punch. And then the 2 punch is, but we want to expand that. Dr. Ed Robinson, an ancestor from Philadelphia, he used to talk about what he called the infusion program. And the infusion program was designed for school students from elementary up to high school. And what was done in that infusion program, or what should be done in that infusion program, is to take world history. And when you talk about world history, you're obviously starting and ending, I would argue, with African history. So this infusion program, it looks at science and math and history and geography and physics. And it tells the story of those things from where those things came from. The genesis of language and art and science and monotheism and all that comes from Africa. So if you want, you can call it African history, but it's really world history. So what I'm saying, to answer your question directly, the one punch is, let the critics know that they're defining critical race theory wrong. Explain to them what it is, but don't stop there. Say, yeah, this is a law school thing, but I want to take this two punch. And that two punch is, I want to tell the story of world history. I want to tell the story of European history. I want to tell the story of American history. And just like that old crime drama from the 1960s, just the facts, ma'am. Just lay the facts out. We don't have to get into any argument, any editorializing. Let's just look at the facts. And the facts start from the beginning. 200,000 years ago, Nile Valley region of East Africa, the first human being walked the planet. Now, that's not some Afrocentric scholar saying it. That's one of the leading Eurocentric scholars, Louis Leakey. And I always refer to European scholars when I make my arguments, because folks tend to believe them. But if an African-centered scholar says the same thing, they want to do more research. So let's stay right here. Yeah, the African-centered scholars say that the first human being walked the planet was in Africa. So that's the beginning. We got to talk about that. And I talk about that because I want people to know that the first human being who walked the planet was the Nile Valley region of East Africa, whose skin was like ours, nose like ours, hair like ours, for at least, and there's some debate about this, but for at least about 150 to 170,000 years, they did their thing alone. You know, certain archaeologists make the argument that the European, as we know him or her today, is about 30,000 years old. So for 150, 160, 170,000 years, Black folk in Africa doing their thing. Science, math, calculus, algebra, astronomy, all that kind of stuff. And then fast forward to 1492 with Columbus and the Europeans encountering people of color. And from that day down, it went to hell in a handbasket. Then we jumped from 1492, and then we jumped to 1619, and we talk about American history. So all those things I just said to you, that's part of the infusion that is infused into all of the academic subjects in schools, which is not the same as the critical race theory. So I'm not just stopping with explaining and defending critical race theory as a law school concept. I'm going even beyond that and say there's other stuff about history, factual stuff that needs to be taught to everybody so they know what the real deal is.
Yeah, Sharif, I'll bring you in here. You know, that's one of the things that I think is really the rub here, is wanting a certain segment of American population wanting to protect their children from learning those other things that might make them uncomfortable. As a matter of fact, it's written right into a lot of the laws that are being passed. No child should feel uncomfortable or responsible for history in their lessons at school. I mean, how do you address the fact that that is really what some parents are trying to defend their kids against, is learning that stuff because they don't want their kids to learn it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. Anytime someone talks about, you know, no child should feel, they really talk about white children. Right? They have not cared how Black kids have felt in schools. We see that from how the inception of public schools. We see it how they're funded. We see it today with the experiences that so many Black children face within the school. So when they're talking about, oh, we don't want our child to be, you know, and I hate this term, but I'm going to just use it here. That's that nursing that so-called white fragility, you know, into the space. You know, look, I mean, at the bottom line, America, we got a race problem. But instead of looking at Black folks, we need to really look at what Corey just talked about, like this white savagery that's going on. That is the race problem. That's always been the race problem in this country as well as around the world. And so I think the combination of critical race theory, but also having to understand, because I call that the capital CRT, right? Critical race theory. There's a lowercase CRT that they've also been resisting. Like they've kind of, and lump everything. So the lowercase CRT is culture responsive teaching. And just how do you understand, children that you don't look like? Right now, 80% of the public school teachers in America are white. And not only are they saying we don't want our children to understand lowercase or uppercase CRT, we don't want to prepare teachers to go into schools that, that are full of children that don't look like them, that don't share that cultural background, that don't share that socio-political connections and commitments. And so I think, everything that Michael Kort talked about is about teaching. And as he was talking, of course, this always comes up. It reminded me of my elementary school, Nithal Musasa, right? Because Baba Changa, who was our 5th grade political science teacher, our history teacher, which, as you said, we didn't call it African history, we just called it history. Right? Yeah. And he used to say, like, listen, just because someone dominates a sphere today, that does not mean that explains the root of it. And so he was also for, and that's physical education. We didn't take, the typical gym or, we took martial arts. We took African martial arts, Vidasana. And he said he would always talk about, and he would always make these connections that Michael Kort just talked about. He would say, regardless of what the dominance right now, have you thinking where martial arts originated from? The oldest history and examples and evidence of hand-to-hand combat and martial arts are in the walls of Egypt. The hieroglyphics demonstrating and showing martial arts and how it went from Africa to Asia, Africa to India, to China, to Japan. He would show evidence of that as elementary school students. So we're like, oh, regardless of the movies and all this stuff that we like to watch, we had a grounding of there's evidence of this is thousands of years old, hand-to-hand combat on these walls.
But
Sharif, it's good teaching.
It's good teaching. All of what you just said is true. But what I think you fail to realize, my brother, and this is going to be very important.
I fail to realize a lot in the world.
Yeah, but this is what's going to be real important for your learning and your understanding. A lot of that stuff did happen in Africa, but it was brought to Africa by aliens.
I forgot that part.
Yeah. See, like for your learning, you don't think that they built the pyramids, bro, for real, do you? I mean, isn't it more reasonable to understand that UFOs landed and dropped those pyramids in Nubia and then
never returned?
Never returned.
And you know what? As funny as that is, it's really sad because I tell that same story that, at first they tried to say that some folks in the Middle East created the pyramids. I'm like, what the hell is the Middle East? I thought it was North Africa. That's the first thing.
Exactly what
and then when they realized that it wasn't the Middle East, but it was North Africa, then, oh no, it must have been Black people who created the pyramids. And then within the last, 20 years or so, I'm actually hearing from people saying, well, instead of giving it to the North Africans, let's give it to the Martians. And people really making that argument. The idea that American educational system would rather give the pyramids to the Martians than to the Africans speaks volumes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, let me show you something real quick. This is Chris Stewart going on a little bit of a run here, but you mentioned, Brother Kort, you mentioned white savagery. Sharif, you have made the distinction before. Let's call it what it is, white savagery. And I don't think that everybody's ready for that. But I just want to do a quick historical kind of roundup that is all stuff we've already talked about on Freedom Friday before. And on the other side, I will ask you guys, how do we teach this in ways that's in accordance with these new laws that are being passed? All right. So father stares at the hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter that was severed as punishment for failing to make the daily rubber quota in Belgian Congo, 1904. You all know who's behind this. You all know the mastermind. Like, we got a Hitler in Germany, but that's 6 million. How many in Congo and elsewhere where lives were lost? Now, get your mind around how you teach young people that in the history of the world, that this father is looking at the hand and foot of his 5-year-old child. Don't be desensitized about this picture. Don't read this as a black and white picture. Read this as a parent and as a father and a human being, and ask yourself who the human being responsible for this father looking at these two severed, what is the psychology of the person who is responsible for this father looking at these two amputated pieces of his 5-year-old child? And this isn't made up. This is 1904. Go look it up. Let's not be stupid. Let's not be ignorant. Let's know what we're really talking about here. Mary Turner, pregnant, lynched in Georgia for publicly criticizing her husband's lynching. They hung her upside down, cut the baby out of her stomach, and stomped the babies with their feet, the baby with their feet. Let's not be stupid about our history. 1918. So the previous one was 1904. This is 1918. Ask yourself, what was in the psychology of the people who hung a woman upside down, cut her baby out, and stomped it? And don't act like these are rare and isolated situations. These are situations I'm bringing up because they're representative of many things that were taking place at the same time. How can we talk about these things or teach about these things in accordance with these new laws that are being passed without it making someone uncomfortable? The Trail of Tears. I'm going to need my people to go look at the Trail of Tears, right? Yep. And ask yourself, what happened during the Trail of Tears? Who had power and who didn't? Who died and who didn't? And what was in the psychology of the people that marched thousands of people to death, to their savage death, even as they were called the savages? That's the beautiful thing about white supremacy and white savagery, is it's self-cleaning, permanently self-cleaning, but it also projects onto its victims their own kind of crimes. Trail of Tears. Go look at it. COINTELPRO. We've talked about this in this show. Your American government coordinated the actual destruction of black people and black civil rights organizations who were fighting for their rights. Your government did it. They did it systemically. They had a system. Go look up the documents, pull the documents. It wasn't a random act of prejudice. It wasn't random acts of individual white racists. It was systemic how they did it. And you can tell how systemic it was by, even when you get the information now, the number of redactions. The number of redactions still tells you that your government still doesn't want you to know the lengths that it went to destroy your people. Recy Taylor. Recy Taylor was a 24-year-old woman walking home from church who was picked up by a group of white boys who took her to the woods and raped her. Her husband was told by those white boys' attorney, let us give you $400. What do you think a nigger is worth? You think your nigger wife is worth more than that? $400? We raped her, 24 years old. What people don't know is that was one of the first cases that Rosa Parks picked up. She picked up the phone at the NAACP when this case came to their attention. And this is what made Rosa Parks Rosa Parks. It wasn't sitting down on a bus because she was
not being tired. Yeah, exactly.
It was because she was actually systemically, critically looking at rapes across the American South that were so prevalent at the time. Rape of black women was the first civil rights issue, and it was happening all across the American South. What was in the psychology of several white boys in a car who pick up a 24-year-old woman on the way home from church, rape her in the forest or in the woods, drop her off, and all get off by an all-white jury? And they offer the husband a few $100s with the tagline of, what do you think a nigger is worth, right? I'm going to speed through them. Decades later, Memphis is finally going to compensate the black sanitation workers of 1968. This is an article from just a couple of years ago. Dr. King died in Memphis for these people to have their rights, and they weren't getting compensated until. Do you know that in 2017, when this was written, there was still a Black man who was a sanitation worker, who had been a sanitation worker when Dr. King was there to fight for their rights, who had still not been made whole by his union or by the city? Did you know that? Right? That feels systemic. If only there was a way to study the systems. This is a redlining map. I'm not going to go all through it. You all have heard about redlining.
Yeah, that looks familiar. That looks like a familiar map. Mm-hmm.
Now look at this map. The red is hazardous areas. Guess where they put all the Black people and refined Black people to?
Well,
guess what that did? Guess what that did?
Philly, I see North Philly.
I see Oakland, Cincinnati, Minneapolis. Keep going down the list. And think of the red zone where they put all the Black people as the not going to have wealth in the future zones, not going to build wealth zones. Seems systemic though. This is a map. It's a city map. Seems systemic. Many Black war vets were denied the GI benefits that made other people rich, made other people form intergenerational wealth. The Social Security, initially Social Security excluded domestic workers on purpose to dislodge many Blacks from getting the benefit. That's systemic. That's a government benefit that made people rich. Long Island just recently did a massive test on their real estate market, thousands and thousands in an investigation of thousands of interactions with real estate there, and found that 49% of the time, Blacks with equal credit and equal backgrounds to whites are discriminated against in the housing market, which is one of the key ways that people make wealth in the United States. And we bring it and just wrap a bow on it with education. Educator bias is associated with racial disparities in achievement and student discipline. And it doesn't even do it justice to just drop this thumbnail in there, because there's so much research that tells you this in the education system. From the top to the bottom, the thing is rigged against kids of color. The research is telling you that. Okay, I'm sorry for the long kind of tour through history, but I can't say anything that I just said to a classroom of kids and stay within the law. Help me out as an educator. Everything I just told you is the true reading of the public record of the United States and the world, right? But I can't teach young people of color that, or white people that, and stay within the law. Help me out, brothers.
Well, I'll defer to the educator, then I'll follow up.
Okay, fair enough. Well, listen, I think, as Cord talked about, there's muscle behind policy, and they're using the law. I think if you're going to be an educator, you have to apply what Thurgood Marshall used to talk about, the law. Do the right thing and let the law catch up. So do the right thing and let the policy and law catch up here, right? If you are going to be an educator, then this is what you have to understand. And you can do it in ways like, you're an educator. So you're a planner, as you're an architect. You're an architect and a demolition. Like, you have to demolish whatever kids are coming in with. Amir Suleiman has a poem out about build and destroy. You have to do both simultaneously as an educator. You have to look at what are the paradigm. When people talk about educating children where they're from, meeting them where they are, you have to understand it's not all about the policies and the institutional racism. That's worthy of all our effort. We also have to understand a lot of these youth who are coming in schools are taught at their dining room tables and their car rides home about racism, and how to apply it, not how to fight it, how to apply it, how to enjoy it, how to prosper from it. And so we have to recognize that as educators. And some of y'all educators are just going to have to decide, where do I want to teach? At the end of the day, where do I want to be? Do I, in some of these states where they're doing that, if you are silent, if you're not resistant, if you are not joining like-minded groups and community groups, this shows why educators have to be connected to their communities. Because when you try to do it from afar and disconnect it from the people, it's not going to work. And you will more likely side or be complicit on the other side, who are doing these kind of things, that have these laws to support the savagery that's happening. Now, just practically, and I understand that, I've always had the privilege of working with my people and in community. So, these weren't the type of, struggles that I had. But if I was in a place like Arizona that don't want to recognize Dr. King, or don't want to, support immigrants or whatever it is. And if I'm in those type of spaces, I can put that map of Philadelphia up and just have students, hey, let's analyze this, right? Like there are ways to talk about and teach history, but allowing and being that facilitator, which the best teachers do anyway. They're presenting. Why does this map look like this? What are the intentions? What do you think are the outcomes? Let's connect the dots. I can put two side by side, which is one of my favorite activities as a teacher. Two things. Put that picture of the Belgian massacre and murder and mayhem that they unleashed in the Congo, and then put a picture of the 1978 and 1985 Rizzo and good administrations, police departments, violence against MOVE. Let's look at today, the MOVE child that they have been using the remains as props in class, and that picture with the Congolese father and his murdered daughter. To me, that's the teaching. Let's when did this stop? When did that train of thought, when did that mindset, when did that savagery stop? Show me and prove it to me. That's what I would tell students. Prove to me that it stopped. They're going to bring up certain laws and bills and be like, okay, well, this happened after the Civil Rights Law. This happened after the Voting Rights Act, right? Bookend things, have side by sides, and just unleash knowledge, and let them sift it out, organize it, think about it, wrestle with it. And let them know in the front end, it's going to be uncomfortable for all of us. I cringed when I saw that picture. And so, it's going to make us all uncomfortable. But that's what learning is. You don't learn in comfort zones. You learn when something's being agitated within you.
After hearing that, that's exactly why I deferred to the educator so that he could break it down like he did. And I love that phrase he used about build and destroy. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing because it's consistent with what I talked about with my 1-2 punch. It's not just this or that, it's this and that. So I like that concept of building and destroying. I also like a weird concept of brainwashing. People are like, well, why would you like brainwashing? Well, if something is dirty, you got to clean it. So if a child or an adult's mind is polluted with white supremacy / white savagery concepts, then that brain, that mind must be cleaned. The other thing we need to realize is, and I think in regard to your earlier question, so what do we do? Well, I think we have to realize that you can't convince the devil, but you can convict the devil. What do I mean by that? These are some great arguments that we all laid out, eloquent arguments, persuasive arguments, but we can make those very same arguments to a principal of some suburban school or some superintendent of some rural school. And not only will it not go in one ear and out the other, it won't even go into the ear because they're not listening. So we can't convince the devil, but we can convict the devil. In other words, we just throw the facts out there and let them land wherever they might. The other thing we have to understand is that we have to stop giving our children over to the enemy. It's like we're in hell here in America, and we're upset because Satan and the demons don't teach our children. Well, Satan and the demons are not in hell to teach our children. And that's exactly what we do in a metaphorical sense by giving our children to the enemy. And then we're frustrated and disappointed when the enemy does what enemies do, when the devil does what devils do. And I'm not talking about white people being devils, all white people, just like I'm not talking about all black people being angels. But what I will say is this: a devil is what a devil does. So if you do devilment, you're a devil. And we in the African community can't expect the devil to do the right thing. I think it was Christopher earlier talked about some of the devilment, the horrific stuff, talking about Reese Taylor and talking about the Congo and talking about Mary Turner. Let me just throw in there, since we're talking about some horrendous stuff, when we use the phrase savagery, I want people, because I'm not going to go into graphic detail right now, but just Google something called Derby's dose. Derby's dose. What was Derby's dose? Again, without getting too graphic, it was a system of punishment by white, quote unquote, slaveholders, in particular, a guy by the name of Thomas Thistlewood, where he would force one beaten battered, brutalized, enslaved Black person to defecate in the mouth of another beaten, battered, brutalized Black person, enslaved Black person, and that victim to have to deal with that for 4 to 5 hours. Let's pause right there for a second. Who would think of something like that? Who would think to do something like that and then actually do it? That's what we're dealing with. And that's why it's so important that we teach our own. You know, it's interesting to me, and I want to wrap this up very quickly by saying this. I've been a baseball fan from the very beginning. I mean, I'm only a lawyer today because I didn't make the final cut at the Phillies Reading minor league back in the 80s. That's a whole nother story. We'll talk about that later. But my point is, I love baseball. And I've been a fan of Negro League baseball. And when I noticed that people each year celebrate Jackie Robinson getting signed, I'm disheartened by that, because Jackie Robinson getting signed destroyed Negro League baseball, and not just Negro League baseball, but all the businesses around it. So I think our approach has to be more to do for self, to teach our children, to create our own African-centered educational programs. Because once again, should you really expect your enemy to educate your children? Of course not. So we have to do it ourselves. And the final thing I want to say, it's so funny because we're laying out these facts, historical facts. And you would think that when you lay out the facts, you can persuade your enemy. But we're dealing with a different kind of enemy. Think about this. The Black Lives Matter movement. It doesn't say Black lives are supreme. It doesn't say Black lives are superior. It simply says Black Lives Matter. And we got to fight for that. So understand who we're dealing with and act accordingly.
And I just, on that last point, first of all, let me back up and just say, I put the link to Derby's Dose in there. Hadn't heard of it. Craziest nonsense I've ever heard. Woo! But I will say this much. My question still stands earlier. The more reading I do about the history of white supremacy, I find those type of examples. And I always have to ask the question you just asked. What is going on in the mind of the person who thinks that stuff? Like who you invented this? You sat around and you thought of this. Like this came to you somehow. It didn't come from Jesus. So let's be real about this. Because when you use the word devilment, Jesus wasn't all up in your mind telling you about how you could create these types of punishments on human beings. So honestly, it makes it hard to care about whether or not somebody's child is going to feel uncomfortable that this gets taught, because I'm going to be uncomfortable with my children not knowing the level and the depth of evil that exists within the world and that they could become wrapped up in. So let me just say that the last thing you said too about the Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, the initial kind of frame of that hashtag was two. Black Lives Matter also.
Okay.
It was the devilment that said, well, how can we reframe that in a way that will offend people? And let's put only in front of it, only Black Lives Matter, and pretend like that's what they're saying. Let's pretend that they are saying only Black Lives Matter. So then the retort from the devilment people will be, no, all lives matter. No, not just. And the original quote was basically assuming white lives already have mattered forever. Black lives matter too. Also, damn it, include us in the humanity that you want for your own people. And even that was a bridge too far for some people. Even a bridge
that was a bridge matter. That's y'all uppity Negroes to even think that, let alone say it.
We have told y'all forever it don't matter. What do you mean?
I'm just curious what you two legitimate and professional and real educators, are you as extreme as I am, where I say the hell with the standard public school system? We just build our own schools. Do we need to go that far? And I got to admit, I'm not really feeling that completely, because we pay taxes to the public school system. So if we say we're going to take our kids out, we got to take our money out too. But we can't take our money out. So what do? I defer to you two real educators.
Well, Sharif's the real educator.
Well, I mean, but I'm going to start off by quoting Chris, and you know, we would bash, you know, verbally and resist this idea of enslavement reform, slavery reform. So how do we talk about education reform? And, if we're just tinkering around the edges of a system that was not only not thought about Black children, but the success of it. Because it's one thing to say like, oh yeah, we want to open up schools for children. No, as Genesis was it to create success for Black children. And when have we found that? We still haven't found it because we can't find a single city where Black children are being educated in mass, where they're feeling whole in mass. Not a single city in the wealthiest place in the world. And so that means there must be some things that's anchoring it down back to its inception. So that's one. Then when you couple what you said with what Malcolm X's words, right? Only a fool will send his child to the enemy to be educated, right? And then what Black people experienced in history. And these are all things that students can also wrestle with, right? That Black folks were creating their own schools and paying taxes for white schools at the same time, right? And so they were like, no, you can't come here, but we are still going to levy a tax against you, right? You're barely out of sharecropping, or you might still be sharing. Like, we're going to take more money from you, more resources from you, apply it to this. We didn't want poor white kids to be educated either, but now that we see y'all walking around with books, so we're definitely going to make sure white kids have books, and we're going to levy taxes. So then we're double taxed, right? And so then we do this taxation without representation applying to the success of education in this school. So I wrestle with that a lot. So I don't even know if it's radical. To me, it's practical, it's logical, it is instinctual. So, but yeah, 100%, but Winston Churchill, when he talks about history will be kind to me because I intend to write it, we should recognize what that means. And this is one of their heroes, right? And they learn from each other back and forth. The two imperialistic of America, the children of the British and all the folks that they used to war with, and said, hey, let's stop fighting each other. Let's unleash havoc around the globe. They say things and they put it in print. They write about it. They talk about it. Then they try to hide it, right? Even though it's still open, whether it's COINTELPRO and other places, they write about this savagery, but then say, "Don't teach that. Don't touch that. Don't talk about that." Right? It's like, wait, this is you. You wrote it, and you still could not hide the truth.
Well, I will. I'll say this: to be white is to be part of a construct that was a consolidation of lots of peoples that weren't family. They weren't together. So it was a purposeful consolidation into an artificial construct that was made to be distinct from everybody else on purpose for profit, power, and gain, right? So I just want to call things what they are. What they are. When we talk about white, there's no such thing as white. There's no white country. There's no white place. It was a consolidation of an initial group of people who could theoretically be considered pigment-wise white, who then included some other people that pigment-wise make no sense as being part of that white collaborative. But it was a business deal. It was a social business deal. And that business deal created systems, created a country called the United States, which created systems. And that business deal and those systems actually live on the way that they were for years and years. One of those systems that it's important to talk about is the education system. The education system that has miseducated generations of not just Black people or brown people or others, but white people too. And it has retaught the consolidation to succeeding groups of immigrants who weren't even part of the original white program. Right? It so-called Americanized them into a race of people for a caste system to create their position. This article right here is about how textbooks taught white supremacy for years. You can find many articles that will tell you what the history books looked like for years, what your grandparents learned about all the things that we've taught so far. They learned straight up white supremacy ignorance. And they learned it from generations. So when we come to a day like today, where we do have some choice in what we will do with our kids and where we will put them, and I hear Brother Cord ask the question, like, shouldn't we just start our own? That is the difference that I always point out between civil rights thinking and abolitionist thinking. Civil rights thinking believes that the system is basically good. The Constitution is basically good. The laws are basically good. But if we just tweak them, they'll be better for all people. If we just amend them, we'll mend the Constitution, right? We'll amend it. How do you amend a crap sandwich? By putting a tomato on it. How do you put a tomato on it and call it a California burger, right? It's a crap burger, but you put avocado on it and suddenly it's a California burger, right? Amending is civil rights thinking. It's taking the premise that was wrong from the devil from the get-go and trying to mend it and make it good with God in your ear telling you that that was never supposed to work, right? That was never supposed to work, right? Abolitionists are clear from day one, this is a crap sandwich. I don't care what you put on top of it. There is no such thing as slavery reform. And that's the way we have to look at the education system. It was a crap sandwich from the get-go, and we keep trying to dress it up with different condiments. When in actuality, we need to be abolitionists about it and say, no, this is a crap sandwich. I'm sorry, I'm not going to feed my children crap.
Yeah. And again, this is stuff that we can
wrestle with. A bad analogy too, by the way, but this brother started it with the derbies.
No, I think it's appropriate, and I think this is the stuff that you can use to teach children, right? Like Malcolm, one of the things I used to love to teach about students, to my students, I had the benefit of being, one in Black schools, in Black neighborhoods, and I was a history and literature teacher, right? So I was like in heaven, but when we would wrestle with this idea of the Constitution. Right. And as you said, Chris, this is basically a great document. But when students were looking to see how Black people were actually talked about in the few times that they were mentioned, and they're able to see that as 8th graders and understand, like, wait a minute, like, what's all this celebratory stuff about this parchment when this is how they looked at us. Right. And then sharing them with Malcolm's words are like, you're not really a citizen if they got to keep adding legislation to recognize you as a human. Because the people who they viewed as human beings, they were central to the document from the beforehand. They ain't have no amendments to make a white man whole, a wealthy white man whole. That was the foundation of the core of the document, right? And so when we're looking at this and finding ways to educate children and being creative, but also just factual, right? And you can apply this to any content. We're talking about math, and you're not bringing up African contributions to math. If you're teaching science, if you're going through a whole 180 days, and you have not talked about Africa, you've not talked about Black contributors to science, then you have done a disservice. You have promoted racism, and you should reevaluate your positionality as an educator. And are you a liberator or an educator? Or oppressor, right? Are you teaching?
Sharif, let me just
destroying?
On that point, my 9th grader in the school system that he is in right now, to date, because I've asked him this question over and over and over again. What have they taught you about X and X and X and X? And I keep watching out for it. They have studied wars so far. He's in 9th grade. So far, they have studied wars and state history, just our state. Like some stuff relevant to our state. What they haven't taught could fill up entire libraries, but they haven't even touched, forget about learning anything about Africa or even global history. Like, they have taught a very narrow American U.S. history, and it's been mostly revolving around the great wars of America, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, why are y'all studying war so much? Right? Like, I don't understand it.
And if you're going to study wars, study the various versions. The war against the Black mind.
Yes.
Study about the wars against Black communities and First Nation peoples. Study the wars about, in the Philippines, right? So connect the wars, not just like, this was happening. No, connected to imperialism, connected to racism, connected to hegemonic, mindsets, do all of that. So if you're going to do it, do all of it, right? Talk about what was the atrocities that were happening in North Africa during the World Wars. How do you talk about World Wars and don't talk about what they were doing in North Africa, Central Africa, right? Like, how does a whole war, a world war, center on the Western margins, depending on where you're coming from, and Europe? That doesn't make sense. That's not a world war. You're studying European history.
But Sharif, critical race theory is the real problem here, bro.
It is. That's what should be banned.
Yeah,
that's what should be banned.
It's funny, as I'm listening to you gentlemen, I'm like, this is a great panel discussion, but a horrible panel discussion. What I mean by horrible is that every time you both speak, I'm writing stuff down and I'm losing my place. I'm losing my train of thought. I'm like, okay, Chris said this and Sharif said this. So that's a wonderful thing. And I'm supposed to be part of this, but I'm like learning. And I'm so glad you are. And speaking of learning, I believe it was somebody named Frank who left a comment saying rewrite the Constitution. And I'm glad that person wrote that, because that gets back to my point about critical race theory being a law school / lawyer's concept. And if you're talking about the law, you got to start from the beginning. That's the Constitution. And if the root is poison, then the fruit is poison. And the root is poison because in 1789, when the Constitution was adopted, there were 5 specific clauses, 5 that promoted racism. First was 3/5. So we all know about that. The second was the Electoral College. We know more about that today than we have in the last 20, 30 years. The third one is federal military aid to the South in case the quote unquote slaves rebel. Number 4 is, and this is interesting, that in the US Constitution, 1789, the founding fathers said slavery is bad. It's a horrible thing, but we're making too much money. So what we're going to do here in 1789 is to say, we're going to continue importing Africans for the next 20 years. Think about that. They didn't say we're going to stop slavery today in 1789. They didn't say we're going to stop importing Africans into America. They said in 20 years. So we'll stop it in 1808. That was the 20-year extension of the importation of Africans into slavery. And then there's a 5th clause which says that if you're an enslaved person in a slave state, slave colony, and you escape to a free state, free colony, the Constitution mandates that you be brought back into slavery. All this stuff is part of the fundamental law of the United States of America. That's critical race theory. Now, how could you not support that being taught in law school and in college and in high school and in junior high school? And the other thing I want to say very quickly, I'm not talking about some old stuff from 1789 and stopping right there. I'm talking about in the last 4 or 5 years. Give me 30 seconds. In 2016, the Solicitor General for the state of Kansas filed a legal brief. The facts of the case are not relevant, but it was a legal brief in a case called Hodes versus Smith. And in order for that Kansas Solicitor General to persuade the Kansas State Supreme Court that his argument should win the day, he did as all lawyers do. We find other cases, precedent, and we include them in our briefs to support our argument. In 2016, 4.5, 5 years ago, the Solicitor General of the state of Kansas cited the 1857 Dred Scott decision to support his argument in 2016. Why? Because he was a smart, albeit racist lawyer. He knew that the Dred Scott decision of 1857 has never, I repeat, never been overturned by the Supreme Court. We can look at Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, and say, okay, that did overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, 1898. But there has been no case as of today, 2021, where the Supreme Court overturned the Dred Scott decision. And that's why a lawyer just 4.5, 5 years ago was able to cite, think about that. Think about the audacity of American racism, that a lawyer, top lawyer for a state, would cite the Dred Scott decision and think that it would carry the day. Because
can you give Taney's remarks about that, like the central part of the, can you share that with the audience too? There's a central theme in the Dred Scott that I don't want anybody in the audience to miss.
The Dred Scott decision, although the most blatantly racist decision in America, is the most honest decision in America, because Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote for the majority, quote, "Black folks have no rights that the white man was bound to respect." Now think about that. He wrote that in 1857. Blacks, quote, "had no rights that the white man was bound to respect," unquote. That still applies today. And the fact that that decision has never been overturned, the fact that that decision said that blacks not only were not citizens, but could never be citizens, and the fact that a top lawyer in the United States would cite that case because it's never been overturned, tells you everything you need to know about why critical race theory is absolutely essential.
Mhm. And again, that's a lesson, like taking that case, sharing that quote, and having students. I wouldn't even I wouldn't even teach. I would say, here's what Judge Taney said.
Yes.
Your job is to prove whether it still exists or doesn't.
Yes.
That's their job, to go research and find and provide evidence of whether it continues to exist. And I guarantee you what they'll find if they have already, the prerequisite is to teach them how to do good research.
And speaking of good research, and that's a great point you make. Just quickly, because I want to throw this law thing in there so people appreciate it. It's a legal concept.
That's why you're here, brother.
I got my lawyer hat on. In fact, I got my lawyer suit on. Just ran out of court an hour ago. Look at the 13th Amendment, and people say, well, that quote unquote freed the slaves. Well, first of all, we weren't slaves. That's a whole nother issue. We can do a class on that. The fact that we weren't slaves, we were black people who didn't have guns. That's what we were. Because if we had guns, then we wouldn't have gone through that. But let me just say this. We look at 13th Amendment, we think that, okay, that's a great start. It ended slavery. But if you read the 13th Amendment of 1865, what it says is this: slavery and involuntary servitude are hereby abolished. But it doesn't say hereby abolished, period. It doesn't say hereby abolished, exclamation point. It says slavery and involuntary servitude are hereby abolished, comma, except following conviction for a crime. So here we are thinking that the North is our friend, but the North capitulated to the South, added that little part at the end of the 13th Amendment. So what did the South do now? They transformed us from quote unquote slaves to criminals. Because that little clause says, comma, following conviction for crime. Now you create stuff like vagrancy laws, loitering laws, curfew laws. There's laws that, for example, you couldn't be within 500 feet of a railroad line because black people are jumping on trains. And the best law, or I should say the craziest one, is the white women yelling law. There was a law. When I say law, I'm saying that legislators sat down, discussed, debate, introduced, and passed a law saying that black men could not raise their voice in the presence of white women. They passed laws saying that. So every time I'm down in Center City and there's a white woman anywhere nearby, I'm yelling for no reason at all. And people are wondering, why is that black guy yelling in Center City? I'm yelling because there's a white woman standing next to me. But in all seriousness, these are laws, as I pointed out. The policy of America is racism. The laws are the muscle to enforce that policy. And that's what we have today. And the final thing I'm going to say very quick, because people often say, well, Mike, you always playing a race card. You're always talking about racism in regard to law and everything else. And I say this, first of all, America dealt from the race deck. I'm just playing the hand they gave me. But having said that, I say, look, to white folks who accuse me of that, I say, if tomorrow, all things being equal, you had to be a defendant in a criminal case, and that defendant, all those defendants, they got the same jobs, same income, same car, same suit, same name, but you had to go as a black defendant or a white defendant. Everything else being equal, which would you choose? Or it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're leaving Temple University, you're driving down Broad Street, lights and sirens from a police car come on behind you. As the cop approaches you, all things being equal, same car, same job, same everything, you could be a black driver or a white driver. Which would you choose? So the answer is obvious. Why would nobody choose to be a black defendant? Why would nobody choose to be a black driver? It's because racism is America and America is racism, and the laws from 1619 to 2021 prove it.
Well, I'm about to prove you wrong on all of that, my good brother. My good brother. You said a lot there, and I think, it sounds wise and whatnot. But I'm about to prove you wrong. Before I do that, though, I do want to say on one of your points, there was a study years ago, and they asked white people, how much money would we need to give you if we were to tell you that you were going to be black for the rest of your life? And this was years ago, and the average number was over $1 million. Like, you would have to make me a millionaire to convert me to black, and then I would agree to do it. And the question that came out of that study is, well, if everything's so equal and everything, why would it take you $1 million to want to be black in the United States, right? But anyways, we got a White Supremacy Incorporated sent us a message in our comments. So I want to just, this is proving you wrong, because just so you know, I mean, We must be thankful for the Constitution. It founded a country like no other in the world, and in modern times is the only one that gives freedom and light to people around the world. Is it perfect through its past? No. But, you know, there is a reason that people are fleeing to come here, even now. Yet, do not understand, some do not understand our Constitution, are trying to take our country away from a United States back to a civil war. Why? It will cause the destruction of the United States. So, I mean, brothers, I mean, very simply put, you guys are wrong, because like the Constitution created a country like no other in the world. And it's been all good. And I mean, no, I mean, is it perfect? I mean, did we lynch a few people, kill a few people, systemically make sure that some people never become wealthy enough to enjoy the country? Do we like color code all of our systems? Do we color code the courts, the mortgage system, even the military, the law, justice, commerce, every area of life activity, as Francis Cress Wessling taught you years ago? Did we color code all the systems? I mean, yes, but it's the best country in the world for people like me.
Yes. Let me say this, Christopher. You know, you're better than me because I'm so arrogant in my blackness. I don't respond to stuff like that. I literally ignore it. I mean, I ignore it with the utmost and extreme arrogance. You know, if my face were the finger, people would understand exactly what I'm talking about. I don't respond, and this might not be politically correct, but when white people ask me to explain myself, I don't. I just don't. I just ignore you and keep it moving. And it's not because I can't beat you in the debate. I can crush you in the debate, but you're not on my level. It's like Jay-Z used to say, you know, why would I have a battle against you? In fact, the quote came from a fight, and Jay-Z said, if you shoot me, you're famous. If I shoot you, I'm brainless. And that just makes so much sense. So you're trying to come up to my level. And even a better analogy is I'm like the heavyweight champion of the world. I'm Muhammad Ali. You some guy who, I don't know, 98 pounds and lost 50 fights in a row. And you want to challenge me to a fight. You're holding a press conference and you expect me to come to that press conference to engage you. Man, you get the finger and I
will say this much. I agree with everything you just said, 100%. And there is no but here. This is an and. Because I forgot who it was. Is on one of our shows. There's a famous black scholar, and I wonder if it'll come to me later. But famous black scholar who says, you know, I debate my equals.
Yes.
Everybody else I teach. Right.
I love it. I
agree with that. Except for this is how upside down white supremacist world is, though. Upside down world is that a black genius can't get tenure at a major university, but a black imbecile can become president. A white imbecile could become president. That's the type of world we live in. We live in a world where a black genius can't get a job at a major university, but a white imbecile can become president and leader of the free world.
And that
is the dangers. You know, that's the danger.
You make. You look at Barack Obama, love him or hate him, but you got to agree, lawyer, Ivy League educated. I mean, just the quote unquote, the best and the brightest. That's what it takes for us to get there. But for them, just grab anybody, you know, with this crazy hair and this elementary school education and this preschool vocabulary, and he could become president.
Leader of the free world and have the finger on all the buttons. Woo. The nuclear codes and everything else. What's that?
And all the butts.
There you go. Yes. There you go. And that's white power. Well, listen, brothers, we have come to the end. A couple of people, actually, Tony Morris, thank you very much, sir. Tony told me it's Dr. John Henrik Clark. Who said the quote about like I debate my equals, everybody else I teach. So this has been another riveting conversation. I appreciate both of you, brother El Mekki, but also brother Cord, for coming on today. Any final words to the people who are watching critical race theory be misrepresented for political gain in the country? Your final words.
Very quickly, and I will make this quick. First of all, we need to understand what it is. And understand that we don't have to explain it to anybody. For me, that's key. We need to know what it is. And if we want to explain to people, let's explain it. But don't feel obligated to justify yourself to white folks. If you want to brag about your scholarship and your intellect, go ahead and do it. But don't feel obligated to answer the white man's question. That's my position. I'm sticking to it.
Sharif?
Love it. Yeah. So three quick points. I think one, and I agree, like we should not allow it to be a distraction. I think, some of my team at the Center for Black Educated Development was really talking about what we actually should be centering is what does great teaching look like? What happens when a Black child has a positive racial identity and understand their history, and tying back to Marcus Garvey. If you don't know your history, you're like a tree without roots, right? And so if we want them to rise as this mighty group of youth and accomplish what they will, to paraphrase Garvey, then we have to understand, like, we help them connect the dots between the systemic racism that exists, how history has been manipulated, and how to research and find the truth. And I would encourage everybody, as part of educating children, make sure they read an 18-year-old's essay about the purpose of education. An 18-year-old senior at Morehouse that we know as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was an 18-year-old and talked about this education and the character, intelligence plus character. And he talked about, like, hey, there's some geniuses, but they employ a mindset of white savagery, and this is why their education is faulty. That education, I think it was Talmadge or somebody. He was a politician. Talmadge has, and Taney and all these other folks who create policy and laws, they have an intellectual genealogy, and it permeates the textbooks, as you showed. It permeates classrooms, and so we need a group of resistors to push against that. And I'll end with Neely Fuller said, like, listen, when it comes to this racism stuff, this white supremacy, white savagery stuff, there's the tacky, there's the trashy, and then there's the terroristic. These laws are the terroristic part. The teaching and all of that can also be the terroristic part. We have to make sure that we are educating our youth, and we cannot allow anybody else to undermine what we know to be best for our children.
I love it. Well, this has been another Freedom Friday. Freedom in its genesis is about truth. And truth is about justice, and truth leads to justice. So anybody who doesn't want you to know the truth, or try to obscure the truth, or hide the truth, or veil the truth, is somebody who is actually trying to prevent the world from ever being just. And I don't think that Jesus was that person. So some of y'all need to go talk to whoever your Jesus is, because sometimes I want to ask you, which Jesus? Which Jesus? Jesus the revolutionary? Jesus the revolutionary, or which Jesus are you talking about? But what I don't want to ever do is let you forget the father looking at the lopped off limbs of his 5-year-old. I don't ever want you to forget the psychology that made this a headline from 1904 is the same psychology that exists in people that will kill Trayvon Martin and indict him for his own murder. Will kill Tamir Rice and indict him for his own murder. Will storm the Capitol, tear the place up, and do all kind of lawlessness and burning, and then blame Black Lives Matter and Antifa. The psychology that lopped off these limbs for profit and to make you work harder and for money is not a dead psychology. It's a living psychology, and it's in power. It's a psychology that is in power still today. If you don't want your kids to know that, you don't want a just world. You actually want a continuation of the world that lopped off the limbs of a Black child because his father wasn't profitable enough in working for free for a capitalist institution. You don't have to like me for telling you this. You have to respect me for the fact that I'm not going to stop telling you this, because it's what's just and it's what's real, and it'll get us to the world where we can all be free. And we're not there yet. Thank you all. On that somber note, you don't deserve a good note this week because you're still racist as hell. So on that note, I will say thank you, brothers, and look forward to another week next week of telling the truth to the world.
Thank you, gentlemen. Much appreciated.
Thanks.